you started your professional life as a hedge fund manager or a hedge fund employee and made a transition to journalism. You just told at the table a long story about that, but give us a brief summation.
I was working somewhat by accident at a hedge fund as an analyst and was a little unhappy. I learned a tremendous amount there. I had an incredible mentor and boss who had hired me, but I knew that that was not going to be my life calling. And my father was extremely anxious and thought I was going to end up starving on the street because I was going to leave. And so I started taking journalism classes at night, and I took a class called Writing for New York City Newspapers and Magazines. And in that class, it was given by the New School. The teacher would have editors of different newspapers and magazines come in and speak to the class. And this was incredible because these editors would come in and say, well, we publish a lot of freelance pieces. We're interested in these following topics. Here's my email address. So I started trying to kind of hustle around and meet some of these people. Eventually, jump ahead in the timeline, after 9/11, the hedge fund I'm working for sheds about half of its employees. I was one of them. I traveled for a few months with my then boyfriend, now husband. My dad was extremely anxious and screaming at me about it. But then when I came back, I ended up getting a job at the very bottom of the totem pole as a fact checker at the New York Observer, which was then edited by Peter Kaplan, who, I don't know if anyone here knows him, but he was an incredible editor and mentor and sort of famous for cultivating young talent. And I remember when I went in to intern there, again, I didn't really have any experience or anything, but typically when you'd have a meeting with Peter, he was a very quirky, charming guy, but you'd go into his office, which was complete chaos, piles of books and papers teetering, about to fall and crush you to death. And he would turn his back to you and just scroll up and down on his computer while you're trying to talk to him, and it was very disconcerting. And he said, well, tell me about yourself. Like, what did you do? And I said, well, I just worked at this hedge fund, but I was kind of unhappy. And as soon as he heard the word hedge fund, he went, huh? And he kind of turned around and he said, wait a second, you know something about those people. And I said, yes, I'm trying to forget about that, but yes, I do know something. And he sort of said, okay, go sit in that chair and you work here now. And that was basically how I started. And then I was very fortunate to have this little germ of expertise about an opaque and powerful industry where all the money comes from, basically. And that's been incredibly helpful to me.
So even though business and finance are not important topics at the New York Observer, that was your beat.
It was, and that was difficult because no one knew about it or really
or cared necessarily,
or even cared or appreciated, but they kind of understood intellectually that this was really important.
Right.
But it was not the passion center of the paper.
And quickly, then you went from there to how soon to Businessweek?
I worked there for a few years, and I managed to write a couple of freelance pieces on the side, including 2 pieces for The Atlantic. That was very exciting. And then I got hired at Condé Nast Portfolio, which folks may remember was a brief-lived but great business magazine. Great concept. The idea was to do a kind of a glossy, high-level business magazine. We used to say, oh, it's like Vanity Fair crossed with Fortune. It just sounded so great. Now, of course, it started publishing in 2007, and something very exciting happened in 2007 and 2008, which is that the whole economy basically blew up and collapsed. And for me, that was when business journalism became extremely interesting, because suddenly, there was this huge financial crisis, and suddenly it went from being this field where it was like profiles of rock star CEOs and all these glorifying of their accomplishments, to suddenly everything was exposed. Like everyone could see what had really been going on behind the scenes and under the surface. And that was when I became very interested in it. But Portfolio, unfortunately, from a business standpoint, didn't
It
last.
lasted about a year, I think.
I mean, it might have been a couple years,
Yeah,
and there was like a
could have
year leading up to the first issue where they had brought on this whole team, and we were preparing, and that was a long time. But then it folded. Yes.
Right. But so then you were a business journalist, and you wanted to talk today about how business journalism is a good entryway for our children and grandchildren, who want to get into
Who
journalism,
we fail to dissuade from going into journalism.
despite what our fathers might think, right?
Yeah.
Their father.
Yes. Well, so I would just make a pitch for business, finance, and money in general as a beat. And I always suggest this to writers who are starting out because there aren't too many people who feel comfortable and confident dealing in those topics, but they are hugely important. They are the underpinning of everything, including what's going on in Washington. I mean, there are a lot of people who want to write about culture. They want to write profiles of authors or celebrities, or they want to write about senators and presidential candidates. I mean, the money is the story underneath all of those things, driving all of it. And so if you are comfortable in that world, you will always have a job, and you will always have a wealth of really interesting, weird, challenging, but fascinating stories. There's no shortage of good stories on that beat. So that's
Partly because there are a lot of people who are driven, in the business world, driven to make money and get rich, and ambitious and good profile subjects.
Yes, and a lot of criminals too, if you like to write about crime and the justice system.
And a lot of people we think are criminals but haven't been convicted. Steve Cohen, I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Your words, not mine.
Sheelah wrote a whole book about Steve Cohen, and I edited a couple of cover stories on him, and he never was convicted. But now he owns the New York Mets, and everybody loves it. Well, everybody will love him if he brings the Mets in a championship. So, one reason that it's a good thing to have a background in business these days is that you understand better than the rest of us artificial intelligence, which is one of the topics we wanted to talk to you about. We wanted you to talk about today.
It's a big topic. Yes.
Yeah. What can you tell us about the AI and journalism specifically? And
Well, I am very concerned, not just about journalism, but about everything and AI. And I guess the way I would approach AI as a journalist and as a story is as a story of regulatory and political failure, frankly. I mean, we were talking earlier about the lawsuit the New York Times has filed against the ChatGPT owners regarding the use of their intellectual property to train the AIs. I am stunned that no one in Congress, for example, anticipated this, and our entire economy has just been left open to these AI companies coming and doing whatever they please, where it really should have been a thoughtful discussion and some regulatory framework that everyone agreed on was in place. So now, we're at the mercy of the move fast and break things people who are running these tech companies who think they can do whatever they want and just sort of bulldoze society into accepting, and that has worked so far. So I am very concerned. I wish there was a good answer to how to solve this, but there has to be some kind of agreed set of rules around how AI is going to be developed and how it's going to work and who's going to own it and who's going to benefit financially from it. And without those guardrails in place, I think it's very scary.
have you used it?
I'm embarrassed to admit I haven't really used it. My children have played around with it. It's cool. It has a long way to go, but I think that any expert in the field of AI will tell you that even though it's very clunky and seems, to some people it seems somewhat useless right now, it's going to improve very, very quickly. So whatever is happening now is not going to be what's going on 6 months or a year from now. I mean, it's going to learn and improve at an exponential rate. So anytime I hear someone say, oh, it's, it can't write well, it's not good at XYZ, that will change very quickly. So
My son is looking for a job, and he used AI to write the cover letter on his job applications.
And how did that work out for him?
It's a very nice cover letter. Yeah. Anyway, has anybody stolen your material? With relation to
I haven't checked, but I'm sure that all of anything that
Times
I've written
suit.
on the internet has been scooped up. I mean, of course, but I haven't specifically looked. Partly because what good does it know to know for sure? I mean, there should be some recourse. Someone should have thought to prevent this from happening this way, and it didn't happen. There's nothing you can do at this point. But yes, anything online seems to be fair game for them. So,
My favorite story that you've written lately is called The Parent Trap, which is about Professor Bankman and Professor Fried, parents of Sam Bankman-Fried. You told me at lunch that they invited you to come visit them and write their story. Tell us about that.
well, it wasn't. They didn't invite me personally, but they felt very strongly that their son had not been given a fair opportunity. I mean, you may disagree with this or not, but this was their view. They felt that they had not been given the opportunity to tell their side of the story, and they felt, and I think still do feel, that he wasn't treated fairly, and that a lot of things he was accused of were misconstrued or were not criminal, whatever it is. So they wanted a chance to just tell their side. And to their point, there are various things that happened with the case, sort of apart from his guilt or innocence, that were troubling, and I understood why they were troubling. But so they contacted someone at the New Yorker, and the story just ended up with me, partly because I was available at that moment to do it, but also because I had been obsessed with the story from my...
And you know
yeah.
something about crypto.
I know something about crypto. I know something about financial fraud. I mean, that's sort of one of my real areas of focus. And I had been trying to get a Sam Bankman-Fried story going at the New Yorker until we found out that Michael Lewis was down there with him, embedded in his house in the Bahamas when the feds came. So I mean, it just at that point when that became public that Michael Lewis was finishing up a book, we all thought, oh, okay, forget it. Like the master is going to go and tell the story. So, but then when his parents surfaced and it was communicated that they were interested in talking, I ended up with that assignment and went down there and met with them. They live in Palo Alto on the Stanford campus. There are a number of faculty houses on the campus.
Uh-huh. And they must have been shell-shocked by this whole development. Their brilliant billionaire son, international celebrity, is all of a sudden international celebrity felon.
One thing that all of the family members I spoke to kind of had been shaken by was just how quickly the treatment of Sam in the press had changed. He had gone from being a god, a rock star, hero. He was going to be the world's first trillionaire, according to one of his venture capital investors. And then suddenly, like that, it was like he was the villain of the century, and people were publishing, pieces about his prescription drug use. Everyone was taking Adderall, and they just felt, I think, very shocked and stung, having experienced that sudden reversal. And I think they'd gone through a period where there were cameras outside the house. They were scared. They had to keep the curtains closed all the time, so they were a little bit traumatized by that experience. And then I came to understand very quickly that they believed very passionately that he had not done anything wrong, that whatever he had done was not criminal, that there were others who bore responsibility, who were not, being implicated in this. I remember going and doing a big piece about Uber right after Uber went through a period of just serious problems, including criminal allegations, people being fired, riders being sexually assaulted by drivers and nothing happening, the rampant harassment going on inside the office. law breaking, all sorts of stuff had happened at Uber. And then finally the board had stepped in and ousted Travis Kalanick, the founder, who had been the rock star god and then suddenly was the villain of the century. So there were all these other examples of this having happened at other companies. And a lot of those people did not end up going to jail. They just had grown too quickly and didn't have a risk manager or an HR person or a proper lawyer on staff. So I think that they, in that context, they regarded whatever had happened at FTX as being another one of those examples. And they probably would have said, well, why did the Uber leaders not go to jail? They didn't have a risk manager or a chief legal officer until they were quite large. That would have been their perspective. I don't necessarily agree with that, but yes, things obviously were out of control, and I'm sure that his parents wish they had intervened in some way to stop their son from destroying himself. And
because they're Stanford Law School professors, and they should have known.
Well, I never saw evidence that they were really that deeply inside the management of the company. I mean, the company was being managed by Sam and a couple of his friends on their computers. That was the management, the brain trust of the company. They didn't know, like many of us, myself included, they didn't know what crypto was. They'd heard of it, but this was not, and they were also not finance experts, but they were really not that deeply inside of what was going on. I was never convinced that they knew that all this taking of money from one thing and putting it into another was necessarily happening. If it was happening, Sam seemed sure that it was okay. And but I think that from the outside, and this is the skeptical journalist in me, I always looked at that from the outside during the rise of FTX and thought, something seems a little weird about this. And I'll always remember this day I took a hike in upstate New York with a very good friend who has had an illustrious career in the wonderful field of corporate law and has done very well for himself. But he had gone to Stanford, and he was expressing some wistfulness about the road not traveled and about Sam Bankman-Fried's incredible success. And he was one of the world's youngest billionaires at that point. And this friend said, oh my God, look at that. And I'm just a lawyer. And I remember thinking, this is just not what it seems. This seemed too easy. I was never convinced about crypto. I had never been completely sold on how real it was. And the fact that you couldn't understand what people were even talking about when they tried to explain it to you was like a red flag to me. I'd seen that so many times before when there's so much jargon and nonsense coming out to obfuscate what's really going on, then that's usually a red flag. So they could have just on the surface had questions and perhaps tried to rein him in.
As you point out in your story, his mother's specialty at Stanford Law was ethics.
That was one of her specialties, yes, yeah. Well, I watched the trial on and off as well. I attended some of it, and I was there for a lot of her testimony, and I had the same impression as you listening to her testify. I thought, okay, this is over. And also because the prosecutors were putting up documents and saying, okay, in this email, Sam is telling you to do this, and you're saying this, and then you decide to do this. So it seemed so clear-cut that there was some knowledge there. Now, I think of having read part of the Michael Lewis book and also listened to his interviews about it and so on, I think he has a lot of sympathy for Sam Bankman-Fried. I mean, I do understand on some level because he started working on that book so far ahead of these crimes emerging that my sense is that Michael Lewis, who I admire tremendously, but maybe had a little bit of a hard time pivoting from his deeply held view about this thing he'd been reporting on for a long time when the facts changed. So I think there's also some truth to the fact that Sam had convinced himself and other people, potentially his parents, that everything was going to be fine, then as long as, if they had not had this margin call, if they had not kind of run out of cash at this moment when the crypto market crashed, that all of this would have been sort of papered over and would never have mattered or come out. And he might be right that if the crypto market had not crashed, he wouldn't have had to pay everyone back at this moment where he had no money to pay them back. And then maybe no one would have known that he was taking money from here and putting it there. And maybe, maybe he would have gotten away with all this. But the fact that, the circumstances didn't cooperate and he suddenly had no money and had lost everyone's money, that, yes, it was a crime, obviously. And I think he had convinced himself that everything was fine, that as long as he kept all the balls in the air, no one would be hurt. And therefore he felt he didn't have criminal intent.
If that woman's testimony is correct, he was a gigantic fraudster.
That's clearly what the jury concluded in an hour and 40 minutes. So I think you have a point.
And if he were sentenced to 30 years, how would you feel about it?
How would I feel? I mean, I think he will get a substantial sentence. Now, do I feel that sentencing in general is, correct and equitable across the system? No. And there are a lot of people who get huge sentences and then others who get tiny ones, and I don't always understand or think they seem fair. So I think you have to look at it in the context of what other sentences people have had. But Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to, I think, 11 years. That's a hefty sentence for a business crime. So I think he will definitely be facing at least that.
Okay.
Is there anything left now to pay people back for what they lost?
Well, so there's a bankruptcy case, and the trustee of the bankruptcy is trying to sell assets sort of methodically. And so I don't remember the precise numbers, but I believe he's raised a few $1 billion to pay back investors, I think. So I don't think everyone will necessarily be made whole. I don't know. But they will get something back. I mean, the fact is they're paying hundreds of millions of dollars to the law firm for advising the bankruptcy. And of course, one thing that I pointed out in my story was that it was the same law firm that was serving as FTX's external legal counsel while the company was growing. And the Bankman-Fried family, rightfully, I thought, pointed out that there was a huge conflict of interest. So why should the law firm, which clearly failed to stop this while they were providing legal advice to Sullivan and Cromwell before, now be profiting from the bankruptcy? It just makes no sense. And it's, of course, the investors who are paying those fees. So before they get anything, the lawyers get paid. So,
Well,
I think that is a sign of the corruption of the bankruptcy system that extends well beyond this one company. So.
Part of the tragedy is that the government is suing the parents to disgorge all the money that they were given by their son, and which they spent paying his lawyers.
I mean, I don't know if it's been spent, but I imagine that they are planning to use that
And
money.
Today it was reported that the parents are suing the government to try to prevent them from recovering all the money that they got. Anyway, moving on. You mentioned cryptocurrency. Does the journalism world deal with that in an intelligent way?
Well, I just tend to be skeptical of everything. And I think that part of that is my personality, but also it's related to my first career in hedge fund world, where in the late 90s, I took a job as an analyst at a hedge fund, and I had no finance background at all. So I came to it with a completely clear-eyed, neutral, intelligent but not well-informed view. And I remember being stunned by what I observed going on in the market at that time. It made no sense to me at all. It was the era of, pets.com going up to whatever crazy price, and I remember Qualcomm made crappy cell phones or whatever, like shooting up. And I just remember looking at these things and thinking, this makes no sense. This is obviously some kind of mania or corruption. And of course it was a lot of it. So I've just been very skeptical of financial assets and their values and the trading that goes on. It all seems, just very fishy and not rooted in reality. So I personally had a suspicion about crypto for a long time, and I had been sort of intending, it was on my long list of stories I wanted to get to do a big crypto story so I could use that as an opportunity to really learn about it, exhaustively. But I kept having trouble coming up with a good crypto story because they were all just these, everything that was going on was these, it was like rock stars of the crypto world, profiles of these young boys doing these things on their computers and how brilliant they were. And I didn't want to do a story like that. It didn't interest me. And then suddenly it all crashed, and it was like the financial crisis. Like suddenly it was exposed, and that's when it became interesting. And no, I don't think journalism did a good job covering it before. I don't think there was enough skepticism. I think there was way too much boosting and promoting going on. That's an ongoing problem. I mean, it's connected to the underlying business challenges of journalism. Being a skeptic and exposing problems takes a lot of time and resources. Writing a puffy profile and putting the guy in the cover is very easy and quick.
Sort of our job, being skeptical.
Ideally, yes, so it should be our job, but we people have to pay the bills too and keep the lights on. So I understand there's a tension between doing the hard work of digging and exposing and maybe pissing off advertisers. I mean, as I reported in my New Yorker piece, FTX had ads in the New Yorker and many other places. Now, I don't think that ever influenced any editorial decisions directly, but the fact is that the businesses are all intertwined on some level. So it is very costly to go and attack these companies until you really are sure that there's something there worth exposing.
So you're not recommending that we all go out and buy Bitcoin ETFs?
I remain a skeptic. I think if you want to have some fun gambling with some pile of money that you have for that purpose, and this is fun entertainment, but it is not an investment. But if somebody has some, puts aside X amount of money for gambling, you might go to a casino, or you could go and play the market and trade crypto. And that's an entertainment. That's not an investment, in my opinion.
Sheelah, you've written a lot about gender discrimination in tech, in the business world, Tesla. Talk about that for a while.
Well, that is another, it's something I feel very passionately about, and it maybe stems from the fact that I have a very feminist mother, but also my first job in finance was working for a woman who ran a small hedge fund. And she was so inspirational because she'd come up through this, the most male-dominated industry you could possibly imagine. She had been one of the first women to go to Harvard Business School. She had been the first woman on the board of Bear Stearns. She had been the head of they called it the high yield department, but it was the junk bond department at Bear Stearns. Can you imagine? And she just had these incredible stories about, how she would wake up from her C-section and call them and, be on the phone with the lawyer saying, "You cannot fire me while I'm out having a baby." She was like a warrior, and I have huge admiration for her. This was another area that was clearly a huge problem, obviously, discrimination, inequality in the workplace. And I certainly don't think it has gone away. One thing I found notable about the whole Me Too movement is that, again, exposing what was going on in a way that forced people to acknowledge it and to care required years of really intense investigative reporting. There had been years and years of people writing essays about how unfair this was and the gender pay gap, and I did many of those stories myself. And it didn't do anything. It didn't help. what actually changed the conversation in a really substantive way was that a bunch of reporters, some at my magazine, some at NBC, some at the Times, they had employers who were willing to pay them to spend months and years reporting that story, and that's what it took. And I just think it's an amazing testament to journalism, but it's also shows you what was that what was happening before was not adequate. And I don't think the issue of gender discrimination or other kinds of discrimination has certainly in work has gone away. But I think at least now certain things that were known to many women out there that everyone just accepted, they're not acceptable anymore. And I think that is a big step in the right direction. So
I love the headline. I know you didn't write it. On one of your pieces for the New Yorker, Wall Street women harassed and power hungry.
Yes, they're a great breed, the Wall Street women. I find them endlessly fascinating.
You quote Melinda Gates in one story. Men who demean, degrade, and disrespect women have been able to operate with such impunity, not just in Hollywood, but in tech, venture capital, and other spaces where their influence and investment can make or break a career. The asymmetry of power is ripe for abuse.
It's still true, unfortunately, but we're on to them.
But then you wrote a story called Feel Good Female Solidarity Machine back in 2016 about all the conferences on women in power, which didn't result in...
Well, so it's interesting you mentioned that, because this was exactly what I'm referring to. So before I joined the New Yorker, I was at Bloomberg Businessweek, and I was very fortunate. I had wonderful editors there, and they let me do all sorts of sort of splashy stories for the magazine. And I had been very obsessed for a long time about what a huge industry had grown up around women's empowerment. It's a big business, conferences, Oprah, TV shows, book clubs, columns, and women were constantly tromping off to these conferences to hear inspirational talks from other women. Sheryl Sandberg is a classic example of someone who would speak at one of these conferences. She's saying, lean in to everybody, and it was this rah-rah thing, but nothing changed. You cannot lean in when they refuse to listen to you at a meeting, or you don't get invited, you don't get given a promotion because you're a female, whatever it is. You're not paid as much. And again, this is what I was referring to before. It took investigative reporting to actually, force people to really reckon with how unfair and how tilted everything was. And it is still a big problem. But I think the women's empowerment conference business has taken a slight hit. And I'm glad, actually. So
there are fewer of those advancement for women conferences that resulted in no advancement for women.
Well, this just became a bit cynical at some point. Yeah, and this is my frustration with the Sheryl Sandberg message, because, her advice to women pursuing high-powered careers was all directed at you and what you should be doing, and she refused to acknowledge or grapple with the systemic problems. And for me, so many stories come down to systemic issues. It's, certain things just cannot be fixed until we fix systemic problems like family leave, for example, and the fact that this country has one of the worst family leave policies in the developed world. So you can lean in all you want, but if there's only so much you can do, just working alone, struggling alone against a giant corporation.
So I'm detecting the answer to one of the questions in the headline of another story you did. What if women ran Wall Street?
Well,
some of those problems would be resolved.
Well, I do. So this was a story that I wrote for New York Magazine during sort of a period where I was freelancing a lot for them, and it was right after the financial crisis, and again, it was sort of a cheeky headline, which New York is so good at. They're so great at doing this sort of display copy and these great headlines. But really, the underlying point of that article is that diversity is really important, actually. And it is the way you avoid groupthink. And I don't just mean gender diversity, all kinds of diversity. Diversity of background, racial diversity, economic class diversity, I think is hugely underappreciated as a driver of problems. So a lot of the issues, crimes, all the subprime mortgage fraud that happened, all the stupid decisions, risky decision making that occurred in the years leading up to 2007 and 8, I think many of those problems would have been avoided if there had been a wider array of people making decisions at those companies and you had more skeptics around willing to ask the question, like, what if it doesn't go up forever? This isn't a thing that comes up again and again. They never made a model of if the thing stops going up and it goes down. Like, this was true with crypto too. They just never bothered to, just as an exercise, make a spreadsheet showing what happens if it crashes. Like, there's no one there who says, why don't we do that? So I really feel that having wider points of view in the decision-making suite would lead to better decisions. So that's what that story was about.
Before we take questions from the audience, one more question about a story you wrote, Pornhub.
That was a harrowing story to work on. That was I mean, truthfully, it's hard to actually say that there was much that was funny because it was just so dark and terrible. It was really a story about sex trafficking, honestly. It was about how Pornhub and other, again, tech companies run amok that are publishing porn online just did not have the risk officer job filled or the lawyer there to vet everything. You know, they were just doing whatever and did not have a proper infrastructure to make sure that there weren't videos of teenage girls being assaulted and whatnot ending up on their website. And again, it's the same story. We've seen it. All of these tech companies run amok. They were growing so fast and making so much money. Nobody was like, maybe we should look at these before we post them, you know? So
Interesting that
yeah.
you see them as a tech story.
Yes.
Tech company.
Yeah, no, tech company run amok. Another one. Yep.
Okay, questions?
Okay. If I were David Remnick, I would have you and Jane Mayer working on dark money and AI.
Ooh, I love that idea.
But anyway,
I'm open for assignment ideas from people in this room, by the way.
to me, the greatest challenge with AI will be the ability to correct it. And I haven't read a good story about how people face that challenge. I wonder what your thoughts are.
That is such a good point, and that speaks to the theme of the tech companies run amok. Yeah, they don't have they have a mechanism for making the thing, but not for fixing it if it makes mistakes. It's just a typical. That's a really good idea. Someone should write about that. You could even just follow one person as they try to get something that is, thrown their life into disarray fixed, and it would be instructive, I think.
Yeah, getting back to Sam Bankman-Fried, I was wondering if you think that any investors in FTX who were very likely very knowledgeable about trading exchanges and how they should be run and the importance of protecting the investors, whether or not you're based in the Bahamas, you're supposed to protect the investors' money. So do you think any of them should be hauled into court, and if money could be accrued from them? Because from what I understand, they had no monitor or put no constraints on Sam Bankman-Fried. It was a free-for-all. What are your thoughts about that?
This is a pet topic of mine, is venture capital investors and what level of responsibility they bear. They bear all the fruits economically when things go well, but what is their responsibility when the thing that they have enabled with their, no strings attached cash causes harm? So I think that's a really good question, and I think quickly, this is like a long, complicated topic. I think to understand why this is such an issue, you have to understand what's happened with that industry, which is that it has been so wildly successful. And there are so many multi-billion-dollar venture capital firms all chasing a small number of startups run by these mostly young guys with no experience. And they are fiercely competing to throw their money at the people running these companies. And then the CEOs get to pick and choose and dictate the terms of whose money they take. It's completely backwards. And venture capital is not supposed to work like that. It is supposed to work completely differently, which is that you invest in a company, and part of what you're giving the company is your expertise. You're going to help. You're going to sit on the board. You're going to help them find experienced executives to run the company. So that doesn't happen in the current environment where everyone wanted to invest in FTX because it was the hot new thing. And Sam Bankman-Fried was able to decide based on who would be the least meddling in his affairs. He could say, well, I will take your money, but in exchange, you have to promise not to ever bother me or ask me any questions. And he was able to dictate the terms. And you had these much more experienced venture capital people who had run other companies, who'd seen, who maybe invested in Uber and learned some lessons. They were shut out and they couldn't play the role that really they should be playing. So I think they should be held accountable, but there's no mechanism for that in our current system, really. I mean, they just skate away. They kind of maybe apologize and then go make their next investment.
Sheelah, I'm a very basic guy, so I'll ask you a basic question. AI scares me. The chatbots and the bebops and all the other stuff. I want to know, in your opinion, how much of a threat or how much of a boon is AI to journalism today?
I don't have an uplifting answer to this question. I don't think it's just a threat to journalism. I think I'm one of the people who thinks it's, it may be a bigger societal concern than climate change, Now, I know other very thoughtful people who I respect who think the AI sort of little bubble we're in right now is a bunch of hooey and it's a bubble and it's nothing. I don't personally agree. I think it's going to change everything. I think it's already happening. We don't even realize it. And there is no sign of people who could actually create some guardrails around this, that they're aware or on top of the problem. I mean, our government is dysfunctional, right? So we can't, Congress can't really do anything, for the most part, to deal with these problems. So, yeah, I'm very worried, not just about journalism, about a lot of things.
Here's a more immediate challenge to journalism as we know it, which you've written about. Sinclair Broadcasting, which owns a chain of TV and radio stations, and Alden Capital, a hedge fund that owns 20 or 30 newspapers. The latest news is that an executive from Sinclair bought the Baltimore Sun from Alden Capital. Conservative guy who is going to probably change the Sun's content.
Well, I have not, Alden Capital, I'm sure most people here know about that company. It's a hedge fund, and the business model is basically you buy an asset, and it could be a retail chain, it could be a newspaper, it could be some other kind of company, and you cut costs, cut, and then try and sell it and make a profit. So that's the model, and from their perspective, a newspaper is no different from Payless Shoes or Toys R Us or a hospital, whatever they invest in. It's just, that's the model. So we live in a capitalist system. They want to make a profit, and this works. They can go do this, and if it's a newspaper, nothing's stopping them from doing that. Nobody says a newspaper is different from a shoe company. So I don't even know what's happened to the Baltimore Sun already. I think they've been under the ownership of Alden Capital for several years. I imagine they've enacted huge cost cuts already that may have well harmed the ability of the Baltimore Sun to do its job properly. And David Sinclair, I know from my own reporting, is an ideological, media owner, and he wants to make money, but he also wants to have a platform to spread his message, which is a sort of a libertarian-esque, last time I reported on him, very pro-Trump message. And I have to imagine that his interest in owning the Baltimore Sun is either to do more cutting and try and make money, or use it as a vehicle to spread his ideological message. And I don't see any other reason he would own it. I don't think he's buying it to be a steward of journalism in Baltimore. So, that's the one of the publications that covered him for years and years, did a lot of really good investigative reporting on David Sinclair himself and what he was doing with his company. Sinclair Broadcasting was started there, I believe, by his father. So, yeah, it's not great for people who care about quality, rigorous, high integrity journalism in that market. It's not.
Final question, Sheelah, behind you here.
You say that government has been dysfunctional when it comes to regulating AI. So I'm wondering what other possibilities there are. Is it just a matter of one entity suing another entity for theft of intellectual property? Is there any hope for self-regulation, or is that just a pipe dream? Do you have any thoughts about what direction we can go in to get it under control?
I wish I had a good solution. So I do think there will be a lot of private lawsuits, different companies litigating against one another over this issue, and obviously that's already happening with the Times lawsuit and others that are going on. I do think that Europe has been more effective at sort of looking forward and imposing rules around tech and AI and anticipating things. And I wish we could emulate what they're doing, but it does require action in Washington, regulatory action. And there was recently a very good example with these revelations about Clearview AI, this company that scrapes the entire internet and then creates basically a huge dossier on every single person whose face has appeared in any internet web page. And there, Europe and in a handful of states, they've actually passed rules saying that they have to get permission to do this with you. But most of the country is totally exposed to this, and no one has thought to make it a crime to do that. So someone's going to do it. If they can make money doing it, they'll do it. So I hope there'll be some grassroots organizing around this, and that it will lead to electing some savvy, good candidates who will help address some of these problems. That's my hope. Thank you for having me and for the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheelah.